All right, this is Senate Appropriations Friday. We are going to be getting our first walkthrough of the Budget Adjustment Act from the administration. We'll hand it over to the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner to take us through the governor's proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Adam Gresham, Commissioner of Finance and Management. And Hardy Merrill, Deputy Commissioner of Finance and Management. So last week we strolled over to House Appropriations and presented the governor's proposed budget adjustment. We went back on Tuesday to go through the language. So we've presented the whole package to House, and we are here to do the same in the Senate. And I typically what we would do is we go through, you see a spreadsheet here, and we just go through it. We don't go through line by line, but we go through most of them. And what I typically will do, particularly with Human Services, is I'll point out a few what I would call eyebrow raising parts of the budget to focus on. But as always with Human Services, there's probably 50 or 60 different movements that is normal in an agency that size moving money around. But there are some that we think we should bring to your attention. And also, as always, the agencies and departments that are behind these budgets are happy, willing, and able to come in and give you far more detail than we can. So with that, what I would suggest is I'll give you a quick overview of revenue, which really leads to our ability to present this budget adjustment. The budget was signed by the governor, I think, the last week of May. It became law, and then 2 months later, the emergency board met, and they changed the revenue assumptions that were used to build the budget. The emergency board met at the end of July. They upgraded the fiscal 2025 forecast by about $184.5 million. So immediately we had $184 million we didn't have the day before. So that we consider to be so-called one-time money that forms the majority of the revenue that we're bringing to bear here. You will also note that, as is common practice, when we close out the fiscal year, there are certain departments and agencies that have money left over in their appropriations. Some of those, most of those, we leave with those departments and agencies because they just haven't had the chance to get them out the door, or it's a work in progress. But there are times when they come to us and say, you know what, we were given $100, we only needed 99, so here's another $1. And the budgetary process is we revert that monies from the department spending authority, and we bring it to the bottom line of the general fund. So also in this budget adjustment, you'll see about $19 million of reversion from the prior year. So when you add that to the $184 million, and there were some subtractions from transfers and truing up and the like, the net is we have about $197 million of revenue to put to use here. So it's that revenue that forms the basis of this budget adjustment. One exception, and that is, of that amount, you will see here put to use approximately $110 million. The balance of that and 197 approximately is we're leaving in the general fund in a temporary reserve we're creating to fence it off and carry it forward into fiscal 26, which we will tell you about when we present you the bill next year. So it's just our way of saying we're not deploying all the available revenue, we're leaving some of that for initiatives that will.
Did you come up with a good name for it?
The temporary reserve?
Yeah.
The temporary reserve.
Yeah.
I don't know if we
gotta come up with a better name than that.
So you'll see in the language document the setup of the reserve. There's no sign of it in the spreadsheet, but we're setting it up in the reserve. So with that kind of overview, preamble, with the chair's permission, we'll launch into our
Unless there's any questions from the committee on that kind of ground setting. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So what we've typically done is, Hardy and I will tag team. I believe he's up first.
Sure, happy to kick it off. So I'll provide a very quick orientation on how to read the worksheet, since there's a few new members in the room. I imagine I won't need to provide quite as much of an orientation on this as I did for the House the other day, but real briefly, starting on the far left-hand column, we refer to the section number of Act 113, the big bill, which is being adjusted, and then we group all the adjustments by functional area, so general government, protection, human services, et cetera. The columns read by fund, and within that, we list the three major funds: general, transportation, and education funds. Any and all special funds would all be combined into the column labeled special funds. So whether it's fish and wildlife or any of the couple hundred special funds that are active, they would all appear in that column. Federal funds, I think, is self-explanatory. Dedicated funds, we don't have any adjustments in that column, but that would refer to things like pension funds. And the Global Commitment Fund, just a quick orientation there for any appropriation within of General Commitment Fund dollars. So any appropriation from the General Commitment Fund will also involve two components of General Fund and federal funds behind that. And when you get into the human resources, the human services adjustments, Commissioner Gresham will be covering. It can be a little complicated and challenging to follow, but this is essentially a duplicated fund. If you see dollars in global commitment, there is both a general fund and a federal fund component. And we'll probably mostly be focused on looking at the general fund, since really what's happening here is we're taking the general fund revenue upgrade and allocating general funds. That's the column we're most focused on. And other funds is primarily internal service funds and interdepartmental transfer. And then in the far right, you've got the total across all funds across the columns. And then in the narrative description over on the far right, what those numbers represent in the narrative description are accounting for the net change in the total column. And I just wanted to speak to you real quickly because it's a little confusing when you read and you see a description in the narrative description column that says $0 and then a bunch of different numbers. If it says $0, that means it's net zero across that appropriation, meaning it's moving from one fund to another. So we're going to have a couple of those that I'll cover, which are shifting from a special fund to general fund, because, for instance, the special fund ran out of capacity. And if it's within the same appropriation, in the far right, it'll read as a $0 net. On the other hand, you could have it moving from one column, from one appropriation to another as well. So with that, if there aren't any questions about the basic format and how to orient on the worksheet, I'll launch into the first line. All set?
Yeah.
Okay, first one's real easy. In the Agency of Digital Services, this is a purely technical correction that was identified in the Statement of Legislative Intent that was provided by the House and Senate Appropriations chairs on June 28th, 2024, and they confirmed in that letter that there was a drafting error that really misplaced a numeral in a number that was drafted. And in the Statement of Legislative Intent, they simply asked that we make the correction in the governor's recommended BAA. So that's what we're seeing here. This doesn't represent any real changes in intended spending authority. In the next category is protection. The first one is an adjustment requested by the judiciary. This is an increase that's related to a small piece of that is related to sheriff's courthouse security. The majority is related to judiciary's technology needs. It's not exactly represented. We're not showing a decrease in special fund spending authority on this worksheet, but what judiciary did really described to us as the driver behind this is they're running into really capped revenue and declining revenue in a special fund called the Court Technology Special Fund. And that's how they typically funded a significant amount of technology spending each year, but the revenue's declining, so they're needing to shift costs to the general fund. And really the reason for that revenue decline is the source of revenue to that funds is primarily civil violations that aren't paid on time. So the late penalties and added charges associated with recovery feed the Court Technology Special Fund. And really there's less revenue because frankly, because of some changes, and most notably among them, driver's licenses are no longer being suspended for failure to pay fines in a timely manner. So these civil violations aren't eventually getting paid. And since they're not getting paid late, there's not the revenue into the special fund. And that's the story behind that one. I'll move on if there's no questions. The state's attorney's line is primarily associated with the $405,000 amount is related to increased agency of digital services service level agreement costs. And that really is tied to increased needs for storage of video evidence that take up vastly greater and ever increasing amounts of storage, which is now, in a cloud format, pay as you go. And we're talking about evidence that does need to, they can't get rid of it. So body cameras are a major, driver there. There may be other video sources as well. Very small change in crime victims advocates also for ADS SLA charges being higher than budgeted, which is a small $38,000 amount there. Public Safety Administration is where we've got a shift that's associated with the CAT Special Fund phenomenon. In this case, there's a large shift within Section B208 from interdepartmental transfer to the general fund column, and that's related to a couple of these technology platforms that are primarily records, criminal records related. So the Spillman and Crosswind systems. So Crosswind is, I believe, what they refer to as the Valcor system. So, for instance, traffic stop, call, get information back on, running a plate, criminal history, something like that. These are the systems that we're talking about. They have previously been funded through the Criminal History Records Check Special Fund, which for a while was something of a cash cow for DPS. And the revenue source to that special fund is, it comes from any entity that requests a criminal history record check, background check on an individual. So most of that is coming probably from employers and employment applications, and anyone who has worked in or lived in Vermont and is applying for a job anywhere that requires a background check is likely going to ping DPS to get that information, and there's a fee for that request. So they have been actually seeing declining revenue within that fund to some extent, which means less pings for whatever reason. That's not necessarily a Vermont phenomenon because these are coming from, all across the country, but I found it just kind of interesting, interesting to note. But these systems obviously are essential and need to, need to continue to be maintained. So they're being moved where they were paid out of the special fund and via this IDT mechanism with the next line B210 criminal justice services. It's now being moved into being a general fund cost in public safety administration.
In B208, the criminal history, or no, what I saw something about liability insurance, what? 297 for general liability.
Yeah, so what they did, and that's within the line that reads with that $0 amount. So that means it's being moved. It was being those are internal service fund charges, all of the things that are named in that $0
Right.
column. They were internal service fund charges that were being billed out to B210 through interdepartmental transfer, which is that other funds column. And then criminal justice services was paying it out of this criminal history records check fund, which they manage. That appropriation manages that fund. But now, because the revenue is capped declining, these are base costs that are being moved into general fund, and that's so those are, along with those record systems, they're also moving these other charges, AES, general liability insurance charge. Those don't necessarily represent dramatic changes in those costs.
Right.
Those are just the change in fund source, because they don't have the revenue coming in from the record checks, essentially, and so that's what's happening. And I think on these, you will see these shifts reflected in the 26 budget as well, acknowledging that, okay, we've got to reforecast what our revenue is and how we're going to budget, by fund. So, any other questions on the public safety lines?
Yes, Senator Watson.
Thank you. This might be too detailed of
Sure.
question, but the Velcro system I had understood I had thought it didn't have computer aided dispatch, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a version of Velcro that does.
I couldn't speak at all to the
okay.
technical details of the systems.
Okay.
All I can confirm is that these are existing costs, and it's no like change in level of service.
Yeah.
These are paying existing overhead costs, whether internal service funds or these record systems, and it's a shift in fund source is what's happening, is all I know.
Okay.
Yep.
So it's just how it's being paid for.
It's the how it's being paid for, yeah.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Sure.
The Human Rights Commission, it says vacancy savings, and it says no vacancy.
Yeah, so what that means is they had budgeted that amount of vacancy savings based on their historical levels of vacancies, but they've got a full vote.
Right.
So since they have no vacancies and they want to continue to pay all of their staff that they currently have on the payroll, this is what we would call a buyback of vacancy savings. So we need to give them that spending authority, which had been basically deducted from their budget based on historically we've had so much, people moving in and out of vacancies, but they've got a full vote. They plan to keep that through the end of the fiscal year. So that's what's happening there. So that's the end of the protection functional categories, and I'll turn it back to Commissioner Gresham for human services rather.
Thanks. So the B300s are predominantly the Human Services Agency, and it includes a few other non-AHS departments like the Human Services Board. The Vets Home is also included in there, which I will address. But it is predominantly the Agency of Human Services. And as you can see here, there are probably 2 dozen or 3 dozen different changes to appropriations. And the total general fund need in the budget adjustment for the human services category is $30 million, a little under $29.5 million or so. Add another 7 for the Vets Home, and so in the B300s, you've got about a $36 million general fund need, additional general fund need. And if you look at the federal component, there'll be another $78 or so million of federal funds coming in. So the total net change in the B300s it's about $125 million, which is fairly substantial for a budget adjustment. But of that, the component of that is about $36 million in total for general fund. The vast majority of the rest is federal funds. So what I typically do, again, to spare you the line by line, and again, the agency and the departments within the agency will come in and speak very articulately on each of these. But in terms of our construct and what's really driving it, I would first direct you to B301, which is the second item in the human services category. And B301 is often referred to as the famous mixing bowl. You know, that's the magical money machine wherein you put $1 and you get back about $2.30. So that's predominantly our Medicaid program. And that is, it's by far the largest program in state government. In total, just about $2 billion. And it's a very big program, and for obvious reasons. I mean, healthcare and taking care of people is very important. So within that mixing bowl, the way kind of the protocol is new global commitment appropriations are shown in the departments in which the appropriations are made. But the component, the mix-in component, the federal and the state components, are then shown in B301. So you see there putting in general fund and federal funds. And if you go down to say DEVA, where the main Medicaid program is, you'll see just the one large global commitment appropriation. So that's kind of the way we budget for this. But you can see, if you look under the narrative description, that all the different changes that are made. And of those, I would direct your attention to the last two on that list. You see a 55.8, almost $56 million Dale global commitment appropriation. And then just below that, you see a 69.4 million DEVA appropriation. And, you know, if I had to describe what's driving this budget and the additional resource need, I would point there first. The 55.8 million Dale global commitment appropriation works out to about a $23.4 million general fund need. And that is the predominantly kind of two things. One is the increasing need for financial assistance that many of the, particularly nursing homes, have required. So emergency financial relief is something that I think really kicked in to high gear during COVID, and it's continued as many of our nursing homes have suffered from the ability to actually service. Well, early on it was filling their beds. Now it appears, as you'll see in a moment, filling the bed base doesn't appear to be as difficult as staffing. So it's really a combination of the two that has really led many of these institutions to be in severe financial distress.
And so these emergency payments are?
Yes, part of that is emergency payments. So the other component actually is what's in fact going to be a consistent theme in this, particularly in the human services category, and that will be additional capacity and utilization in particular. So there's a need for additional revenue to fund more beds being filled and higher costs of capacity, you know, higher cost of servicing those beds. So really from and this is part of the Choices for Care program in nursing homes, really you have a two, and you have some financial relief being given to nursing homes, and frankly, extra payments made to those homes for a greater number of beds being filled and greater costs of servicing each of those beds. So it's really a combination of the two, but you know, when you add it together, it amounts to just under a $24 million general fund need and another $32 million federal fund need. Directly below that in the narrative, you'll see the Department of Vermont Health Access Global Commitment Adjustments, which is a simple way of saying that since this budget was locked in, it was locked in on a consensus forecast for Medicaid need for the cost of operating our Medicaid program. And over the first 6 months of this year, we've in fact exceeded what that forecast would have predicted. So there's been an adjustment, and you'll see there, you know, the EBOR 2 for the following year. I mean, there's a need to adjust upwards the amount that we anticipate spending in fiscal '25.
Increased utilization and increased cost similar.
That's correct. I mean, it's basically, I mean, I think Diva would tell you that the number of Medicaid participants, I think our population has stabilized, but I think the utilization costs have continued to go up, and the cost of pharmacy.
What was that called when we had to reclassify people and we were expecting the roles to go down?
Redetermination.
Has that all been worked through the system, or are we still doing that?
You know, I want to say yes, because it was supposed to have been done within 18 months, but I can't confirm that. I don't know.
There's a question from them when they come in.
In our budget meeting in the fall, at that time, it was not complete, but it was complete to such an extent that there would not be a lot of dollar change, is what we understood that.
Right. So what's kind of interesting, and if you go to B307, which is that, where you'll see the global commitment appropriation to DEVA. What's interesting to note is the need was actually higher than what the net general fund need was, because if you recall, at the end of last year, remember DEVA was struggling because their pharmacy rebate provider, Change Healthcare. Remember they had a cyber attack and they went offline, and it seems kind of obscure, except that this is pharmacy rebates are a fair amount of money for DEVA, and they help offset a fair amount of healthcare costs. So that was the rebates coming in were frozen. And, to the credit of the business office there, they managed to close out the fiscal year without having to dig into the human services caseload reserve, which was originally what we thought they would do. And the thought was that once this cyber attack was cured and business returned to usual, that this money that was not paid out to us in June or so would be paid out. I mean, and that's exactly what happened. So you see a $15 million realization of revenue. And, this would have been a bit of a snoozer had it not happened over the end of a fiscal year into a new fiscal year. But it just happened, say, in, March, and by May, everything was fine. It wouldn't have been as big a deal. But because it happened over a closeout, it caused a bit of concern. Anyway, that's
You say something about the legal aid moving to the Department of Vermont Health Access. What is that?
so that would be something that you should ask them about.
Okay.
I don't, the answer is I don't know. I think actually that was requested by legal aid, but I don't quote me on that.
And I think it's moving from one appropriation to another within
So it's
AHS, is I believe what
And I
that.
assume it's just like the health advocate, because remember we made some changes to that last year, maybe it's. Because the health advocate was in legal aid. But yeah, we'll ask them on
It also may have something to
So
do with the
if
federal.
it was in and you'll see, if you look on the page preceding, in B306, it's showing Vermont legal aid moving, that 547 amount moving from global commitment.
Okay.
And that, so they're moving it out of the global commitment appropriation, B307, and moving it into B306. Probably more of an, accounting, than and it's net neutral, so it's not like a change in service or so forth.
Okay, thank you.
So if you flip the page and you go to B318, and B318 is DCF, and that's the child development. And it's within that appropriation that the much enhanced CCFAP program is located. And you'll recall that there's been a fair amount of legislation over the past couple of years that created the special fund funded by the payroll tax, as well the base appropriation to DCF is also enhanced quite a bit. So one reason why the net general fund need within human services, despite the fact it's been substantial increase is below $30 million, is because they have reduced in total general fund need. In total, they've reduced their CCFAP appropriation by $26 million. And that there's two components to that that they will talk to you about. You know, the first component is kind of a simple utilization component. And that is that there was in the Act 113 current year budget, there was factored in a forecast of need, of utilization of subsidies and grants and the like that DCF believes will turn out to be, by the end of the year, $13 million too high. And that there might be a compilation of reasons for that, but the fact is that what they're saying is they think the appropriation can be reduced by $13 million, and they would still meet the need probably quite handily. So that's a $13 million savings in utilization that is, you know, just like any other program. If utilization lags, we will be able to save general fund and use it for other purposes. There's another, by coincidence, $13 million also of shifting from funding with general fund to funding with the payroll tax. And that is a result of, just like when I mentioned we received $184.5 million of an e-board upgrade to general fund in July at the e-board meeting. What they also did at that e-board meeting is they increased the forecast for the payroll tax collections. When this budget was developed, the forecast they thought, or actually it wasn't a consensus forecast. It was kind of it was a consensus, but it was a consensus between the administration, the Joint Fiscal Office, Finance and Management, a bunch of smart people sitting in a room saying, this is what we think this payroll tax will generate. Subsequently, that requirement was added to the emergency board consensus forecasters. So from July on, every e-board, including in January, they are required to give a forecast of the payroll tax. When this current year budget was locked in, that was not the case. So the assumption there was that there would be about $79 million of revenue generated to this special fund. In the emergency board meeting, they initiated a forecast of $92 million. So the net difference between those was $13 million.
Okay.
So what DCF is doing here is they're saying, okay, so if additional revenue is coming into the special fund, we can reduce our general fund appropriation by that amount. And the total DCF appropriation for CCFAP, general fund appropriation, is just under $50 million. So in this budget adjustment, what you see is they're taking out $13 million for utilization purposes, the underutilization, and another $13 million is being shifted to the special fund. So the net of that is a $26 million savings, which is more than used by other parts of this budget. And they, again, will come in and explain that probably far more articulately than I have.
No, that was good.
Other questions on that? And
So even though you're putting the 13 million kind of in there because of the increased forecast, you're not projecting to spend it there because of the decreased utilization. Your estimate of decreased utilization.
yeah, so we're expecting that overall spending will go down 13 million. That's one thing.
Right.
And then we're projecting that the composition of our funding of that spending will be more special fund and less general fund.
And that's spent within DCF, like in
That's
within
correct.
their.
That's correct. Although, you know, once it is extracted from DCF, it could be spent anywhere. You know, it's general, it's fungible. But the fact remains that human services, as is not unusual, has plenty of uses for money that they're able to save. So the final thing within the B300s that I think is of interest is that the very last one, B342, which is the vet's home. As you know, this committee will remember, and I know that Senator Sears used to spend a fair amount of time thinking about the vet's home. They've been a regular presence at budget adjustment. And traditionally that was because they qualified for a federal match for some of their bed days. And so they have a specific settlement agreement with the federal government that's quite a bit enhanced from what our normal reimbursement rates are. And that is paid typically after the close of the fiscal year. It's certainly paid sometime. I think they receive what their settlement amount will be for the prior fiscal year in the fall. And so they realize that money in budget adjustment, that federal money. So that's one thing that you see. But what has happened over the years is they've also been in budget adjustment for more operating expenses. And, you know, as you read down the narrative, what you see, you know, many of these are, you know, what I would call standard operating expenses like electricity, repairs and maintenance, you know, occupational rehab, transportation, which are much more in the operational category. And, you know, it's been, I think, frustrating for them and frustrating for us. And I think, you know, you guys have also said that shouldn't this be just budgeted for? And so we, this year, and admittedly, they've also had, which you see, for example, with Department of Mental Health and others, they've had a fair amount of reliance on travelers. Travelers are expensive, and so, you know, that was unanticipated. Although we made the point to them that that's been 2 or 3 years as such, so maybe they should project that for the following year. Anyway, the reason I'm going into this is we spoke with them and agreed that their budget for fiscal 26, which we will present to you in a couple of weeks, will be what might be called a real budget. In other words, it will be what they genuinely anticipate their operating expenses to be. It will be, it will not require a visit to House Appropriations and Senate Appropriations and budget adjustment. So I think what you'll notice there is it'll be substantially higher than what it has been before, albeit if you include budget adjustment every year, the net, it'll be not that much.
$10 million.
No, it won't be. But this, again, I think represents both the federal rate settlement, but also some substantial operating costs that we've asked them to please anticipate when we submit the budget for the following year. And we had, I think, a friendly discussion with them on that. So I think they'll come in, they'll agree with that. So, absent questions on the B300s, I would suggest we move on to the B500s. B400s are labor. They did not have any budget adjustment needs. So going to education, there are certainly relative to human services quite a bit smaller adjustments, but I think a couple that are worth mentioning.
Christian, can I ask one question?
Sure.
Under the, well, let's see if I get the columns right here. I just saw another number for the emergency relief. So yeah, the 21 million under B334.1. Is that different than when we were talking about earlier?
Yes.
So what's the difference between
Well,
that?
no, yes, this is the same. That's exactly what we were talking about earlier.
Oh, okay.
So remember that, you know, in Dale, they get the global commitment appropriation in B334.1, but the mixing bowl components are up in B301. So yes, that's exactly right.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. So within education, there are a couple of small true-ups. The first is, you'll recall that several years ago in an attempt to make it easier to become a teacher and potentially attract more teachers, they suspended, is the right word, because I don't think they eliminated, I think they suspended teacher license fees. And that was going to cost a small amount of money. And this special fund received those fees, has some important functions. And so the administration, and I believe the legislature too, committed to backfilling that fee amount. That's why you see the $75 million in that column. The next two columns are actually a good story. There's been more uptake than we anticipated on the adult diploma program. And that is a joint venture between, I believe it's 60% general fund and 40% education fund. So you see the two contributions in B504 and B504.1. That's really amounts to a $500,000 increase in the financial need for the and then finally on this sheet, there's two I would call good news items. By that I mean strictly from a budgeting standpoint for savings. The first one is, so when school budgets are locked in, they are reported to the agency of education. Prior to that, the agency makes a estimate of total amount of school budgets, piles them together into one big number, and that's in part, that's the large component, the largest single component of developing our property tax rate. Well, they make estimates on school budgets by reaching out and talking to schools, but sometimes it doesn't end up exactly the way they anticipated. There's some budgets that might be broken down, there are some budgets where there may have been a mistake made. So this year, it turns out that the need to meet all the school budget requirements will be about $8 million lower than originally anticipated. And if you think about it, the education payment line in the big bill is like $1.99 billion. So missing by $8 million is not so bad. Bit of a rounding error. So there is an $8 million savings there. And then in a bit of a quirk, I think last year they created a line item in the ed fund in the budget for English language learners. And prior to that, that was part of the education payment. So if the school district had a need for English language learning resources, it was part of the budget. This year they backed it out and they created just a separate line item for English language learners.
It's part of the Act 127, the people waiting.
Exactly. But the trouble is, it was never backed out of the education payment, so we kind of double booked it. So here we're backing it out of the education payment. So the net of the $8 million lower education spending and $3 million of double booking is an $11 million savings. Add to that another $2.9 million in savings from the original forecast for the cost of universal meals being higher than what we're forecasting it will be by the end of this fiscal year. So that is savings to the ed fund of about $13.9 million.
Do you know if that was going to continue to go down, or do we feel like we got all the money we can get out of the universal meals funds from the feds, or do you know?
I think I can say, based on what will be, what has been estimated for the FY26 budget, I think the decline is kind of stabilized. So that's the education budget. The good news there is we're dropping about just under $14 million to the bottom line of the ed fund, which, will factor into property tax rates next year. I mean, it's money we didn't know we had going into the year. If there are no questions on that, I was going to pass the baton to Artie to take you guys through the B700s.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. There are no adjustments in the higher education category. In natural resources, there are.
Could I just ask a format question? Like, why is it in here if there's no changes? There is a change, just there's no change in a section.
Exactly. So everything within the higher education category, just as with labor and a few of the others that we saw. All the appropriations that were established in Act 113 are still there.
Right.
And in fact, they're listed in the blue shaded column where it says higher education.
Right.
So that 133 million of general fund appropriation within that category is not being adjusted, hence the blank rows, and after budget adjustment, it remains 133 million. So I guess just we're showing so that all the numbers have to be in here for the worksheet to tie out in terms of starting, like here are the starting appropriations, and then here are the changes. And this is just showing that there are no changes. But those 133 million, that number, for instance, adds up in the bottom line to show our total, on the last page, the total general fund appropriation for the state. So it's really just, it's informational to clearly show there were no changes there, but those numbers are still there. So no change in those appropriation sections. In natural resources, a couple of minor changes, about $35,000 in forest parks and recreation that were related to wildfire fighting, firefighting costs related to wildfires, where there was extra payroll and a small amount of town reimbursement. And then there's about the same amount, $36,000 in DEC related to lab service fees. And that's all for natural resources. As you can see, commerce and community development, transportation, and the debt service functional areas had no changes, so those appropriations remain as passed in Act 113. And that concludes all of the base appropriation sections in the Budget Adjustment Act. And now we've got some adjustments to one-time appropriations, and in a couple cases, new one-time appropriations being added. So the first line at the bottom of page 7 under the one-time appropriations header, the first line is adding $150,000 to an existing one-time appropriation that was made in the amount of $400,000, and this is adding an amount to that appropriation for a household health insurance survey that it was shown to us that this was required as part of this was required by law, but it had not been sort of baked into that $400,000 in that appropriation. And I'm sorry, I can't recall, and it's not stated here what the name and description was of the underlying appropriation, although it is in the budget language. If you wanted me to look that up now.
Yeah, I remember we talked about it.
Keep moving. Okay. The next one-time appropriation, $500,000 general fund to the Department of Health for community grants related to health equity. This is essentially moving an FY24 appropriation to the Agency of Administration for community grants related to health equity. It's moving that appropriation into the Department of Health, which is the ultimate landing place for this new Office of Health Equity that was created in 2023, Act 78. At the time the Office of Health Equity was created, a permanent home for it was not defined in Act 78. The money was sent both for some staff and a one-time appropriation for health equity grants. Those funds were sent to the Agency of Administration. They were not ultimately utilized in the Agency of Administration. In part, there was a delay because they couldn't deploy the funds until the staff had been hired and a report recommending the ultimate place for the office to be. So it eventually ended up in VDH. The $500,000 this is essentially reappropriating money that was reverted or is proposed for reversion within this document in the reversion section of the BAA language. Since it was not used by the agency of administration, it'll get reverted there and now appropriated anew in the Department of Health. So really a technical change, but I just wanted to step through the mechanics of that. The next one is a new appropriation, and it's listed on this document and was initially recommended by the governor as a $4 million appropriation, which is really a contingency for sustainability funding for mental health and substance use disorder residential treatment. And so this is referring to, I guess, the way I am thinking about it is it's kind of like the extraordinary financial relief for nursing homes. When nursing homes say we're going to close we can't pay the bills and we're going to have to close our doors unless we get help. This is that kind of support for mental health and substance use providers. So this is not like standing up new programs or expanding programs. This is to have a reserve, because there are some providers that are expected to have trouble, and this is in order to respond to those cases on a case-by-case basis. And I'll just add on this, I think you made the request yesterday to House Appropriations to actually change the language and increase this from 4 million to 10 million based on some additional developing needs within this space.
4 to 10, then?
Yes, yep. So that change has been requested of House Appropriations by the administration. So.
And they can give us the details when they can, the department.
Yeah, I would expect they could speak better than I could to this. I am just speaking to the general nature, which is these are providers who need help and may not be able to continue unless they receive support.
And it's contingency because there's still like ongoing negotiations with the providers and things like that, and on what funding they have and how things are happening.
That's right. And this will develop. I mean, this is developing as we speak. When this originally was made and 4 million was proposed, we had in the back of our minds certain organizations that we thought needed help, and subsequently we've come to realize that the problem maybe larger or stronger.
Okay.
So.
Okay. The next line is a one-time appropriation for the DCF Office of Child Support. This is $340,000 of general fund that would be matched by $660,000 of federal funds. And this is for transition planning to move their child support management system off the existing mainframe. So this is not actually implementing a new solution, but this is the planning that would be required to inform a future solution that they want to get going. I understand this is one of the oldest systems operating in the state. So I'm turning over to the next page. On page 8, at the top of the page, the $1.8 million general fund amount for DCF for Comprehensive Child Welfare Information System, CCWIS. So this is actually providing an increase of 1.8 million to, I believe it was a $3 million appropriation that was made as one of the contingency appropriations in Act 113. So there were the contingency or so-called waterfall appropriations. If revenue ends up coming in higher than the forecast at the end of the year, a number of appropriations would be made. And that the revenue did come in higher. That appropriation was made, a one-time appropriation for CCWIS. What this is doing is purely a technical move, moving $1.8 million that was appropriated in the base of DCF in section B316 earlier in this document, and it's moving it from there to add it to this one-time pile of money. So it's really for purely administrative reasons to keep all the money in the same bucket for purposes of, managing contracts and paying vendors. So that's just a net neutral move, a change to a one-time appropriation. The next one-time appropriation is, it's unusual to have global commitment one-time appropriations. They're usually run through that section B301, the so-called mixing bowl question referred to. However, on occasion, there are one-time expenditures. There are expenditures from the Global Commitment Fund that should be considered one-time in nature, and we wouldn't want to affect sort of, it'd be misleading to throw them in the base and have it look like it with all the caseload and utilization and everything else. And in this case, there's a $4.02 million appropriation of global commitment dollars, which are related to the global payment program. And so this is in anticipation of the AHEAD model, which requires, as hospitals join the program, we've got to basically put up these dollars in advance for what would be the tail, the claims tail at the end. If they were to come in the program and ever come out, there needs to be that funding for those claims. So,
We have a question on that from the
Sure.
Chair of Health and Welfare.
Well, my question is, what is the date for the contract to be signed finally for AHEAD? With that, I had heard it was January 13th and it was extended for the board to continue some work, and now I think we're up against the decision. What is the exact date?
It's June.
Huh?
I think it's June 1.
June 1st.
I'm thinking it's June 1st.
For the final sign off?
I believe so. But
I
the
thought that
folks
was
who
when
were
it
doing the
was
signing
started.
would know that better. But yeah.
Jenny Samuelson will know the answer. Can we get an answer? Is it possible that we can get an answer to that
Yeah.
question?
I can have it very soon.
we can
Yeah,
ask AHS
that would be
to
good.
provide that information. From a budget standpoint, we understood that this payment would, these payments would need to be
It's an
made in
important
calendar
appropriation,
25. So
yeah.
that's why they're in the budget adjustment
Right.
as opposed to in 26. But in terms of the signing date, we'll find out what we can.
And those two are what's the difference between the two of them?
So this is actually, if we look at these two lines, this can maybe be illustrative of how global commitment works. So you see in the first line, there's two components, a 1.673 million general fund that's then matched by the federal government with 2.346. And that adds up to 4.020 million. And then that's how the global commitment fund dollars of 4.020 are being derived. But essentially, when you see a global commitment fund appropriation, it's what's called a duplicated appropriation. There's actually a double count.
Yeah.
And so when you look at a bottom line on a budget sheet to see what we're actually putting out in cash dollars, you want to look at unduplicated appropriations. But this is how it works. So here you can see it clearly because it's just the two lines. It's like here in one line we appropriate the 1.6 and the 2.3, and that's appropriated to AHS Secretary's Office Global Commitment. That's the entity that receives that. And then AHS Secretary's Office for Global Commitment then sends the money to DEVA, and they send it from the Global Commitment Fund, and then DEVA, deploys that cash from the Global Commitment Fund. But it's this two-step process. And that's why in the B300s, it's kind of hard to follow the bouncing ball because there's so many, underlying, federal fund and general fund components, and then global commitment appropriations and so forth. But that's how this kind of illustrates how that works within those two lines. The final line in the one-time appropriation section is really responding to an emergency board action that was taken in the July emergency board meeting, which took place right after the 2024 flood events. We were looking for some, to reallocate some dollars for flood relief purposes. In the e-board meeting, there was 7 million added to the existing business emergency gap assistance program and another 7 million to create a rapid response mobile home infill program. And the money had to come from somewhere. And the e-board doesn't have the authority to appropriate new dollars, but what they can do is transfer from existing appropriations. And what took place at that time was to look at existing appropriations and see where funding could be borrowed from. There was this appropriation of $20 million that had been made in FY22 to the treasurer's office for bond redemption, to basically, redeem existing bonded debt. After a couple of years, it was still, it still had not been deployed. So that looked like something that was right, to borrow from. It was not immediately going to be used for its intended purpose. However, the e-board directed finance and management to plan for the restoration of that funding in BAA. So here you go. That's putting the 14 back. So
We're going to have the treasurer in to talk about that. Yes.
When you say borrow,
sure.
just a term you're using, you're not repaying that debt.
It's kind of like a transfer and a transfer.
It's just
So when I say borrow, in the context of the e-board, when I say borrow, it's in a different context than when we're talking about bonded debt, which is a different kind of borrowing.
It's like
when I say borrow,
we're giving it back.
what we did, it's almost like the e-board does a mini BAA, and they take and they cross a line through the appropriation amount of $20 million for the treasurer, and they changed it to $6 million.
Okay.
And then they add 7 million here and 7 million here. So so when I say borrow, it's transfer of appropriations is what the e-board is empowered to do via statute.
Okay.
For instance, if there was new revenue on the bottom line, the e-board's not empowered to appropriate new revenue, which is the exclusive purview of the legislature.
If we didn't pay it back, it would just be that they took it. So if they paid it back, we could say they borrowed it.
Right.
Transfer back, yeah. And
Okay.
that's, I think, all I had on one-time appropriations. A couple technical changes that were made to appropriations made in other acts. So in Act 166, there's just a technical change to move. There was an appropriation made to ACCD central office, and that $500,000 appropriation needs to be moved to the Department of Economic Development, which is a different appropriation within ACCD. So that's just a technical change to move the spending authority to where it's actually needed. And then there is this $900,000 amount that is related to Act 181, Section 113B. 181 was the Land Use Act 250, housing bill, and so on. There was a general fund appropriation made to the Natural Resources Board, which I think at the time was called the Natural Resources Board. I think we're now calling it the Land Use Review Board. So I've got to get used to that acronym change. And what the board requested, that rather than have an appropriation of general fund, they would rather have that amount transferred into the Act 250 permit fund, and they would spend out of that fund. And so it's a technical correction. What you can see is if you look down a few lines in the transfers section, there's a transfer of $900,000 from the general fund into the Act 250 permit fund to offset the appropriation reduction above. So that's all I have for appropriation changes. With that, I'll turn it back to Commissioner Gresham, who will talk about transfers and reversions that are taking place within the Budget Adjustment Act?
So there are more than a dozen of those. But what I thought I'd do is give you a brief overview of them. The first one is when the Treasurer's Office estimated the amount that would be needed for debt service. It's a pretty rote mathematical calculation of interest payments and principal retirement. But what they didn't anticipate was there would be an additional borrowing that came, I think, earlier in the year than they thought, meaning that there would be an additional coupon payment required in February of this year. So the addition here is to make sure that we have the financial means to meet our debt service requirements. So we are including that in budget adjustment. The next line.
Commissioner, can you tell me why, at this point forward, you have cents and nowhere else that you include cents?
You know,
I was thinking like, is that 3 billion? I was like, oh no, there's a decimal.
I think because with debt service, you have to give every penny to the, you don't want to be a scuffler.
I can confirm, you know, technically there are no changes in pennies above. In appropriations, we tend to deal simply, we round to the nearest dollar in appropriations. In transfers where you're actually moving fund balances, we can run into pennies. So, but I think next year perhaps we'll format this uniformly and
I'm not sure how that escaped as such, but you know,
I just want you to know I'm paying attention.
Evidently you are. I would note though, under cannabis, there's the same. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, with cannabis and debt service, they're kind of similar.
Because you were required to sweep the whole amount. We couldn't, by law, leave that 32 cent.
To be fair, they all have pennies, it's just that
Yeah, some of the zeros, I think.
it's exact.
So the next one is what we call EROF, the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. Every year, typically in budget adjustment, although it doesn't have to be, sometimes we do it in the big bill, but every year we put a certain amount of money aside so that we can meet municipal match requirements. Often the state provides part of the municipal match and the municipality provides the rest. And this EROF fund is what we use to provide the funding for that. This year is a bit more elevated because of the July floods.
So you're taking it out of the special funds?
No, we're putting additional general fund. We're transferring it into the EROF.
Into the, which is the special?
So it's, yeah, when you look at transfers, and this reads sort of the same way as it would on an operating statement, it's a positive value shows that it's a cost to that fund.
Okay.
And then so the negative would show a transfer in, and a positive number would show a transfer out. But it is kind of confusing because we've just been looking at spending authority sort of the other way around.
Okay.
And the next item there is fairly substantial. As you'll note, so the state of Vermont, state government, we're self-insured. So employees, including I and other state employees, receive medical benefits, 20% of which I pay and 80% of which the state pays. And every year we get together with the folks in the Department of Human Resources and determine what the premium contribution amount should be for the following year. And to provide that amount, we use an actuary, and we work with them to try to figure out what our utilization will be, what our headcount will be, and all the usual inputs. And over the years, we've been faithful in contributing what the required amount would be. But it's, as you'll notice also, for example, with our Medicaid program and the increasing costs there, medical expenses have increased quite a bit more than people anticipated. Be that from higher utilization, be that from higher drug costs. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons for that. But so what has happened is we have under contributed to our health benefit fund, because we have, underestimated what the ultimate, the total cost would be, the total, amount of medical care would be. And as the, costs of healthcare have increased, the requirement to contribute has increased, and we've simply not made that. I want everyone to know here that this has not been purposeful. We've met our actuarial requirement or the recommendation from actuaries. But over time, as healthcare costs have increased, I think the actuarial assumptions have underestimated what the trend has been. You've noticed the same issue with Blue Cross Blue Shield is, had to deal for years, tried to moderate the increase in premiums, and to do that has had to dive into its capital. As a state, we don't have any capital requirement set aside. But the equivalent for us is general fund cash, unused general funds. So we've been able to fund these deficits, but it's not a smart business practice.
So is there a fund, or is it just like a pay-go of the premium?
It's a special fund, but we pay into it every year.
Pension fund, like that we're paying?
Exactly, except instead of being one payment, it's paid over, pay periods.
Yeah, we consider technically an internal service fund. And so we pay into the internal service fund and pay out of the internal service fund to service claims, but it's a self-funded model. It's not a dedicated fund, like a pension fund in that column, but that's kind of just technical jargon. But so
you're not trying to pre-fund it for the future. You're kind of putting money in every year what you think you're going to take out of it.
There were many years when the fund had a surplus.
So not on purpose, just by use of.
No, we don't pre-fund that. But we try to be very careful about it. I mean, it is our employees' healthcare. So there are.
Yeah, I wanted to explain real quick too. There's a reason, because the federal funds are assessed, just as state funds are. So we really can't pre-fund, because then we run into federal audit compliance issues. If they saw a big balance in our health insurance fund, they would perceive that they were being overcharged. That happened a few years ago, and we actually had to do payroll. We did benefits holidays to, at the end of the fiscal year, we actually had no deductions from employees, and the state didn't pay in either to get it to equal. And that was only a few years ago, but now we're on the opposite side.
Put more money in. Okay.
Deficit. So this is an effort to replenish, and frankly, by doing this, what in effect we are doing is we are softening the required premium increase both for the state and for employees, because the other way to fill this deficit would be simply to increase premiums across the board, and ultimately that would be another way of taking in money. So we're essentially acknowledging here that the cost of healthcare and the component of each paycheck that's devoted to healthcare has gone up faster than paychecks have gone up, and so we're trying to help offset that, but we do need to fill that deficit. So that's what that $18.5 million is.
So we could expect an increase in FY26 budget?
That's correct. You can expect it. In fact, I think we could, probably acknowledge, because the bizarre thing is our health care year is a calendar year. Our health plan operates on a calendar year, but yet our state operates on a state fiscal year. So the first 6 months of the state fiscal year will be the last 6 months of the calendar year, so we know what those costs will be, and then we can make an estimate for the first 6 months of the following year. But the net will be, we're estimating about a 14% increase over FY25.
Okay.
So it's going to be substantial. So the next one is we're filling a deficit we expect, and we expect for the last time, the Correctional Industries Fund. You'll recall the Offender Work Program This was the fund that used to, the offender work program used to provide revenue into this fund, except the program is no longer operating. And so this is kind of what I would call a legacy deficit that we are cleaning up. The next one down, the Act 250 permit fund, you'll note that Hardy mentioned just a few lines above. There was a $900,000 reduction in a $1.3 million appropriation to the land use resources board. So that's just the, it's going out of that appropriation and it's coming into the Act 250 permit fund. It's on a net neutral to the state basis. That's more of a technical correction. The next two entries, the Cannabis Regulation Fund and Sports Wagering Enterprise Fund, that just shows in the one hand in the case of cannabis, there's more revenue that came into that fund than we forecast. So we're sweeping more revenue into the general fund. The forecast was for a $12 million sweep. At the end of the year, we had a surplus of $15 million instead. So we're sweeping that in there. There's a $1 million or $1.025 million Vermont Department of Health appropriation in the B313 section, because cannabis revenue is supposed to be 30% sent to the Department of Health and 70% general fund. So there's, of this 3.4 million, 30% of that is, you'll notice, sent to the Vermont Department of Health.
Okay.
With sports wagering, revenues just came in below what they had originally forecast, or pardon me, revenues are coming in below what was originally forecast. So the estimate is for FY25, the revenue will be $860,000 lower.
We were good bidders, they say.
And then flipping the page, kind of in the home stretch here, the Liquor Control Fund, there is a legacy deficit in that fund that has of late grown, largely due to, I think, probably the simple explanation that the direct application that we have taken, the sweep we've taken from that enterprise fund has exceeded the net revenue, the profits to that fund. So over time, a deficit has built up. And, we think there are a number, like with the Correctional Industries Fund, we're trying to clean up some deficits on our balance sheet, and also recognizing that these trends may not be reversing themselves without putting additional general fund in there. So this is an attempt to essentially reset the clock, and our expectation is this fund will run, will be able to meet their projected direct application in the future. I would note that you can expect in the FY26 budget to see a lower forecast estimate from the Liquor Enterprise Fund. If you recall, in last year's budget, there was a $3 million transfer from the Tobacco Litigation Special Fund into the General Fund. That was really a need, let's balance the budget need. There was a bit of extra revenue in the Litigation Special Fund. In retrospect, it turned out that revenue wasn't needed, since we obviously ended the year with a fairly beefy amount of surplus. So we're just returning that to the Litigation Special Fund. And I think also the fact is that we were looking at a small deficit in that fund had we not returned it. So we're just trying to kind of reset there, return what was taken because it wasn't needed. The next two entrants, the Workforce Education and Training Fund, known as the WET Fund, and the Vermont Traumatic Brain Injury Fund, those two funds are ending. The WET Fund long ago has become inactive, although it's carried a balance of $2.5 million for, 6 or 7 years. The reason that hasn't changed either in or out revenue to the WET Fund is because those functions were incorporated into the VDOL, Department of Labor base. So it's not like we're not doing them anymore, but education and training with it is part of VDOL base budget. So that we're just ending this special fund and transferring the balance into the general fund. Similarly, the traumatic brain injury fund has been inactive for well over a decade. And what's left in there really has just interest earnings on what was originally in there. So those two are being closed down. A good story for unclaimed property. It seems to be the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
And not so much for the DFR funds, albeit this is, considering their direct gap is around $60 million. This is not a major component of that, but it is a small amount that they're telling us they think they'll come in under what they had forecasted, in part because, when they make these forecasts, they're making estimates about licenses, applications. They've been a little lighter than they originally had forecast. And
That does it for transfers. The last two rows on the spreadsheet refer to reversions. There is $19.749 million worth of reversions.
54 cents.
And 54 cents to the general fund. Those are described in detail on pages 37 through 39 of the language document. Not sure if there's interest in going through those at this time or not, but essentially, reversions, the term refers to amounts remaining in appropriations at the close of FY24 that are not being carried forward for expenditure and are being reverted to the bottom line so they can be reappropriated. And that includes amounts in base appropriations, but also in one-time appropriations. And we have provided detail as well to the Joint Fiscal Office. We were required to report, along with the BAA this year, a report on amounts carried forward from each appropriation and amounts recommended for reversion. And JFO does have that detail if you haven't been provided with that already.
Okay. What pages is that?
And so the detail is on 37.
37 through 39.
Yep.
You don't have to go through it. I was just gonna.
Yep. I was just making sure there had been a change to the language document. And I was making sure the page numbers didn't change since I had originally made that note here. So those all, once again, pertain to appropriations balances in FY24 that are not being carried forward. So
Is that the same for the education fund?
Essentially the education fund, those are also, the term reversions, refers to, like, by definition, at least how we use it, FY24 amounts that are not being carried forward to 25. So the 24.258 million there.
That's like additional money in the education fund, because in this section, the negative is.
Yeah, so it's itemized on page 39, and the majority of that is being reverted from the state-placed students appropriation, and then there are smaller amounts in other appropriations. A big one, 6.2 million from the universal school meals appropriation. So again, we get to the end of the fiscal year, and there's still 6.2 million, unused that was appropriated for that specific purpose.
But that was above. We had that.
That is adjusting the current year above. Okay. So that's saying in this year, so above, again, when we refer to reversions, we're actually referring to amounts from last year that were left at the end that we're now going to drop to the bottom line to reappropriate in FY25. What we saw above, those are all changes to FY25 current year appropriations. So they're saying now, looking on the radar screen, we're not going to need everything in this appropriation, and something like 2 point something or whatever, it can be dropped down,
But
but
if we didn't do that, it would be a reversion next year.
it would be left in the appropriation at the end of the fiscal year, and then it would revert.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
What's interesting is these reversions from the ed fund are in the commissioner's December 1 tax levy. Because he knew about this. What's in this budget, these are for this upcoming fiscal year. He didn't know about those. So those are baked into his tax forecast.
It's 24 million.
Yes, the 13.9 or not, so that's like found money.
So these are things.
That's what I was wondering, what is the found money and what is?
Yeah, the reversions we essentially know about after the close of the fiscal year, but they're formalized with the enactment of the Budget Adjustment Act.
Okay. Senator Watson?
I have a big scale question, I suppose. Could you speak to how, just what the process was to come up with, I mean, some of the things are obvious, right? Like technical corrections, reversions, et cetera, right? Like those are, I think, pretty straightforward. But, in terms of the amount of money that sort of is found or is, as being freshly appropriated or backfilling debt or, whatever it is, right? How are those decisions? I mean, I understand that it's the governor's proposal, but and maybe there's nothing you can say about the process of coming up with these. But yeah, what is the narrative about how these decisions were made?
So first of all, what I'd say is the tradition, I was going to say protocol, but that's a little bit too long. The tradition is with budget adjustment, that it is just that, adjusting a budget. It tends to be, and historically has been policy like, so what 90% of what you see here is just adjusting numbers that need to be adjusted. However, it's the old saw, one person's policy might be another person's adjustment, budget. So, what's policy and what's not is always open to debate. But we try to keep all of our policies, certainly our major policy in budget, so that we will see in 2 weeks. However, just as an example, there is some what we call deficit mitigation in this. That's a choice that we made to do it in budget adjustment. For the medical benefits fund, for example, we just didn't want to end the year with that much of a deficit. That shows up on our balance sheet. It's not a good idea. So you'll find that there are some decisions that aren't emergencies, that aren't critical, but are good to make. But so I would say that, probably a long way of answering a short question is we try to keep policy out of this, and we save our policy for budget. And the budget is littered with policy. That's what we're supposed to do.
Just as a follow-up to that, because the technical corrections, for the most part, as to like which pots of money things are coming out of, et cetera, like those make sense to me. But I thought I heard at the beginning that there's 110, because there was 197 million unexpected money, and that 110 of that is spent here. So I would, of that 110 million, the majority of that is going towards, as a policy decision, debt reduction. Is that sort of what I'm hearing, or I just want to make sure that I'm understanding?
No, debt reduction was part of it.
Okay.
But the majority of that is in fact going towards what we would call the nuts and bolts of state government. We've had Medicaid,
Caseload and utilization would be the way to sum up the
choices
order
of care.
Mm-hmm.
There were 2 large increases there. The other thing I should have said that I didn't is at the end of every budget cycle, when the budget is signed and becomes law, because we're all human beings, we make mistakes. And it would, I've often dreamed about it, it'd be nice to be able to dial up, the House clerk or the Senate clerk and say, this, for example, one of the things in there is when they meant to make $800,000, they lost a digit and it became $80,000. It'd be awful nice to just be able to call someone and say, but there are very, very strict reasons why that doesn't happen. So this is our chance to make those adjustments. It's also our chance to revert money from the prior year. So there's all kind, and again, those are very kind of technical, just, doing the business, adjustments, but this is the vehicle for that.
Well, it makes me wonder about, if we had not had this
That would be tough.
110 million,
Yeah.
what would these things have done? It
Well-
would just been debt that got carried forward.
The deficit mitigation items would clearly just carry forward into
Yeah.
the future.
Yeah.
And then would be dealt with in the future, one way or another. It could be, for instance, the medical benefits fund, it would just be big rate increases next year, like over 20%, which we just had a 15%. But some of those cans you can kick. It's scarier when you think about, human services adjustments and what's required, just upping the consensus forecast.
Mhm.
And if that money wasn't there, that would be tough. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And just to go back to your opening comments, Commissioner, what was the dollar amount of the future reserve, or whatever we were calling it, the FY 26 reserve fund?
So it was $87 million. But as, Hardy had mentioned earlier, one of the appropriations in here that was $4 million, we bumped up to 10, the provider stabilization.
Okay.
So 80 million, that came out of it. So
If that adjustment's made.
it's a fairly good amount of money to go in. I can assure you, we will present uses for that money.
But did you remember a year where that has happened before, where in the BAA, you reserve money for the next fiscal year? Is that pretty common?
We have typically carried some forward. We haven't created a temporary reserve for, but we typically carry money forward.
How much is in the human services case reserve?
$97 million. Pardon me, $94 million.
But we spent the human services caseload reserve down, but, we keep that for bad times.
Yeah.
And it goes fast.
Really? When there's bad times.
Yep.
Okay.
So we have gone through the spreadsheet. We have a language document here. We're happy to, come back with that, or we're happy to go through with that now. I mean, as you guys.
I don't think we're gonna do it now, and then we'll think about it, and then we'll have the agencies maybe go through some of that stuff, and then have you back if we have questions.
Okay. There are some non-monetary things in here that we can
And
plan.
maybe we'll do that. We'll get through some of the other departments and then look it over with GFO and see what we could be more specific about what you come back for.
I would just say, when, either Diva or Dale comes in the nursing homes, it would be nice, to hear where, we knew we had 18 million in emergency aid. We knew we had spent it all as we finished the budget. And now there's, 30 million, and we changed the rates. It would, we're gonna need to know, have we got this under control?
Understood.
This 30's on top of 18 and plus a rate change.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time and the walkthrough.
Okay, thank you.
We'll be in touch. Thank you.